Chapter 13. Escaping in Style. The ground was hard underneath Arthur, the cold seeping through his clothes. His body ached every time he breathed, his pulse throbbing through him like a drumbeat. He stirred, groaning quietly to himself. Faint light cracked through the sky above him, the scent of dust and rotted wood stuffing up his nose.
This isn't the castle. Where am I?
His mind spun as he gained his bearings. The last thing he remembered was facing King Urgot on the balcony. Those God's damned orange eyes were Urgot's this whole time. His uncle was the one in his nightmares. It gave him a headache to even think about it.
Is that blood on my neck? And seeing Sam die?
He opened his eyes with effort, adjusting to the low light. It must be dawn. How long had he been here? He slowly got to his knees, his body creaking with aches. Arthur looked around the area, realizing where he was. The sword was nowhere to be seen, he realized with a scowl.
That's just great. First the armour, now the sword. What next?
The Londinium alleyway was cold, a cool breeze whistling through like a mournful cry. Wooden planks and old garbage surrounding him. This had to be the poor southern district. Arthur leaned against the alley walls, sighing deeply to himself.
This whole destiny thing is a mess. How could a bunch of words and a blood tie possibly dictate one's future? Especially when it leads to things like waking up in an alleyway after finding your corrupt uncle murdering his commander. Who made this stuff up?
Rattling sounded from beneath a pile of wood, the planks bouncing around sharply, falling from the stack with a clatter. Arthur looked over at the rattling with high brows, moving his legs away from it. A loud thud echoed from beneath it.
Ow!
Who's there?
Arthur asked, his voice stern. A metallic clunk slid across the stones, and the woodpile scattered across the alleyway, one sliding to a stop at Arthur's foot. Arthur frowned at the wood in front of him, looking back up with a scowl. The ground seemed to lift up from underneath the remaining planks, a curious head popping out to scout around with wide, familiar brown eyes. They looked at Arthur and lit up in delight.
Artie.
Tristan, since when did you create another tunnel to the southern district?
Tristan pushed the trapdoor up completely to rest against the wall, a grin on his cheeky face.
It's always been here. You just don't have enough time to explore anymore.
You don't have to remind me.
Arthur grunted, getting up from the ground.
I also found some cool stuff while I was leaving the block,
he added, pulling himself up to sit on the lip of the entrance.
Is it a dog?
Quite the opposite, in fact.
He nodded and reached into a bag on his hip, muttering to it softly. He pulled out a small bundle of golden fluff the size of his palm, pitiful mewls squeaking from the tiny beast. Bright green eyes looked at Arthur wildly, its little body shaking. Arthur raised a brow, looking at the golden kitten in Tristan's hands.
A kitten?
Indeed. I found it in one of the tunnels just outside the castle walls.
That's cool.
I think it's cute.
He sat the kitten down gently onto the cobblestones, the little ball of fluff laying flat on its stomach with its ears pressed back.
Tristan.
Before you say anything else.
He slid back down into the tunnel, his head popping down for a moment.
I've got something cool for you too.
Tristan, I need to tell you some...
Voila!
Tristan's voice echoed, his hand lifting a long leather object into the alleyway, his head raising through the hole with raised brows.
That's my father's sword. My sword, you got it back?
He sat it on the stones beside the jumpy kitten, leaning his arms on the edge.
It wasn't too hard.
How? Where did you get it?
Urgot likes to talk too much. While you were knocked out, he went on some rant about random rubbish and talking to himself. Your uncle's a right madman in more ways than one.
Tristan.
I'm not finished yet. After he dragged you out of the balcony, he left the sword on the floor.
This is important, Tristan.
I grabbed the sword and ran.
Tristan, let me talk.
Okay, I'm done.
Sam Queel is dead. All of the knights are dead. Urgot sent them into a death trap.
The kitten looked at Arthur as if in shock, its small eyes wide. Tristan shared Arthur's expression, his hands clenching and unclenching.
I know, Artie. I saw him die. The news about the explosion is already flying around the kingdom. What in the ether do we do now?
His face was haunted, his eyes bordering on tears.
I'm sorry, Tristan,
Arthur said, kneeling to place a hand on his shoulder. Mournful mewls sound from the kitten, and Arthur looked at it. Curiously, tears flooded the cat's eyes, distress stiffening its little frame. Did it understand him? Arthur turned back to Tristan.
We need to find the others and leave Camelot. It's not safe here anymore.
Tristan looked at him sadly, tears welling.
I feel bad for stealing Henry's salads now.
I'm sure he's forgiven you by now. He'd want you to have them.
Arthur tried to cheer him up. The poor lad would be distraught. Tristan was known to be close to the knights beyond all reason. He was just the kind of soul who connected with anyone. Arthur couldn't blame him for being distressed over it. Tristan sniffled and petted the kitten, who looked at him with fright. Footsteps barged around the corner behind him, coming to a stop.
There he is.
Arthur turned to the voice, a sigh of relief escaping from his mouth.
Maria.
We've been looking all over for you since Tristan came back through the tunnels.
Maria said, moving over towards Arthur.
We've?
Arthur asked, standing up from the ground. 3 shadows turned the corner, Cayenne, Peter and Marlon coming to stand behind Maria. Arthur's eyes flicked to Marlon's face. Bruises peppered his dark skin, a cut on his jaw scabbing over.
We need to get you out of Londinium.
Marlon growled, his voice hoarse.
The Roundtable?
Dead, we know.
Cayenne interrupted.
There's a whole story flying around the city.
Nice to see you too, Pest.
Cayenne grinned at him, facing his palms to Arthur with his arms spread slightly.
At least I'm here ready to escort your royal ass out of this city.
Did you really have to bring him?
Arthur asked, frowning at Marlon.
More is better than less.
Peter grumbled.
The people need you more than you need us. That's what's more important.
Tristan pulled himself out of the tunnel, standing up with the kitten in hand. It wriggled around and hissed at him, its tiny claws scratching his skin like daggers. He frowned at it and put it gently back on the ground.
That's not very nice of you.
The kitten sniffed at him and flicked its tail, darting off down the alleyway. Tristan frowned sadly after it.
Better to let it go than to carry it around all day. It could have been a bigger burden than what we need.
Tristan pouted at Maria, his brows lowered.
So what now then?
Arthur asked, looking at Marlon.
We can't stay here and they'll search the training hall.
We find the next alley out and walk down it.
Peter said, unfolding his arms. Arthur frowned at him.
Anyone have a better, unboring plan?
You sure don't. If you think of a better idea, sound it out.
We could go on a proper vacation.
Good idea, but where do we go? The barons are practically everywhere.
Maria looked down at the tunnel door.
We could always use those, right?
No.
She frowned at them in confusion, Cayenne reflecting on her look.
The tunnels are off limits.
They'd be a better way out.
We're not using the tunnel.
They're too complicated and full of rats.
Tristan frowned. Cayenne's eyes flickered at the word. Arthur caught the hesitance, wicked delight making his smirk stretch.
Have you got an issue with rats, Cayenne?
Arthur grinned, turning back to Tristan.
Maybe we should go through them.
No, I'm not afraid of stupid little rodents.
So if we send you down there, you wouldn't be scared of a rat if it comes near you?
Arthur asked, raising an eyebrow at him. He huffed, lifting his brow at Arthur.
If I sent you into a room full of women, would you know what to do with them? Don't be daft.
As arrogant as ever, Cayenne. Any other suggestions?
Surrendering!
A voice said from further down the alleyway. All of them snapped towards the voice, Arthur tightening his grip on the sword. Arthur narrowed his eyes, moving forward in front of the group. Maria's eyes widened as she backed up, running into Arthur with a thud. She looked back at him for a moment, apologetically, moving away from him to let him pass. More barons rounded the corner behind the speaker, their hoods making them wraiths in the morning shadow.
Let me guess, the king sent you.
By the order of King Ergot, you will be taken to the castle to face your trial.
My trial?
Arthur asked, raising an eyebrow in confusion.
For partaking in the murder of the Knights of the Round Table?
Arthur blinked, his heart stopping for a moment.
What are you talking about?
Arthur didn't kill them. Ergot did. We were at the castle.
The order given was to retrieve you in order to judge your actions. Now come along quietly, or we will be forced to reprimand you.
You've got the wrong man. Ergot murdered them, not me.
The barons advanced towards them, hands on their weapons.
We will see whether you're guilty or not under the judgment of the law. Arrest them!
Marlon stepped forward, a deep scowl on his face.
If I may, I'd like to suggest a...
The closest baron to him smacked him in the jaw with a baton, his head reeling to the side. Blood spurted across the ground from his mouth. Marlon spat it out and turned back to face them with a glare.
I'm telling you lot right now, I didn't kill the Roundtable.
The barons inched closer to them with shackles in their hands, ready to spring.
Gentlemen,
A voice from behind the group of barons said. The black cloaks turned their heads to the voice, Marlon's attention turning to the shadow standing behind the baron group.
might I suggest refraining from using your weapons on the future king?
The man stepped closer to them. The barons closest to him turned around, batons at the ready.
Stay back away, citizen. You don't have any involvement in this situation.
Oh, but he does.
Marlon muttered, his jaw set and aching. The man removed his hood from his face, looking up at them.
Allow me to introduce myself.
The man drew a sword from his side, swiping at the baron's feet. They quickly jumped out of the way, scattering around him. The man turned to one of the barons, snatching away his baton before pinning him against the wall and smacking his face with the weapon. The baron in front of Marlon lurched suddenly, Marlon's fist outstretched in the air. The cloaked man turned to face Arthur and the others with a beaming grin, nodding in greeting.
What are you guys waiting for? Jump in.
He said, swinging back around to the next baron. Arthur smiled widely at Galahad, buckling the sword around his waist.
I was wondering where you went.
You weren't bullshitting us after all.
Peter raised his fists, battling the barons as they launched at him, Cyan fighting by his side. Galahad moved over to one of the barons, kicking the back of his knee. Tristan moved in front of Maria, his teeth bared as he defended her from the baton-wielding assassins, keeping them back. More barons started to charge towards them from further down the street, Marlon throwing the one he held captive towards them like a bowling ball.
We need to move now.
Marlon yelled at the group. Arthur spotted an opening between the affray, darting towards the alleyway's exit. Tristan saw him and followed with Maria behind him, kicking the planks back over the tunnel door as he went. Cyan and Peter trailed after them, shoving off more barons as they went. Marlon moved to Galahad's side, the two moving backwards to block off the alley Arthur ran down. Marlon rubbed at his sore jaw, Galahad looking at him with a friendly smirk.
You're still old.
You're still hiding.
What the hell is this Marlon business?
An alias so people don't come and ask questions.
Have you told the boy the truth?
That wretched Voss squeezed it from me.
Marlon growled and watched a baron come closer, launching him across the alley with a kick. Galahad looked at him in surprise.
Voss is here?
Rohin, too. Ever since these pests showed up, we've had nothing but baron after baron.
I see. Were you the one to draw the attention?
Try the boy instead.
Marlon dodged a swing, gripping the baron's arm and tossing him over his shoulder. Galahad connected his blade with that of a baron's, shoving him back into the others behind him.
We'll take him to the caves. I've got an escort awaiting us at the edge of the forest.
Don't tell me it's who I think it is.
Ryan will be happy to see you again.
Galahad assured, darting after Arthur and the others. Marlon chased after him, flicking a sword up to his hands with his boot.
The question is, am I happy to see him again?
Arthur panted as he ran down the street, hearing Galahad and Marlon trailing behind him. He looked forward to the others, Tristan right beside him.
If you don't keep your face forward, it'll smack into a wall.
Arthur scowled at him, looking back again. Barons chased behind the older knights, coming in floods and joining from the side alleys.
We've got company.
Look out!
Tristan gasped and grabbed Arthur's jacket, pulling him back behind him to a sharp stop. Arthur spread his arms wide as he stumbled slightly, watching Tristan smack into the wall Arthur was about to hit with a hard grunt, the lad flopping to the ground in a heap. Arthur's eyes widened, and he moved to his friend, crouching beside him. Maria caught up to them, her knees skidding against the concrete as she slid beside him.
Gods, are you all right? That looked like it hurt.
Tristan looked at Arthur groggily, holding his head.
I told you you were going to run into the wall.
Arthur reached down, Maria helping to pull him to his feet.
We've got to get to the city entrance.
He said, continuing to run down the streets.
Come on.
Tristan held the wall beside him, shaking his head clear. Arthur looked back, slowing back with a frown. He looked back at the barons darting to them, uncertainty rooting him.
Come on, Tristan, let's go.
Tristan shook his head, his vision swimming.
Just go, Art. I'll catch up.
I'm not leaving you here. Can you walk?
My head.
Tristan winced as he pressed his temple.
Everything is spinning.
Maria brushed the dust off of his back, rubble falling off his clothes back to the ground.
He's going to need help to get going.
She said, gently wiping away the blood trail that moved down his face with her sleeve.
What's the hold-up?
Peter called from behind them, he and Kyan catching up.
Kyan, you need to help Tristan.
Kyan sighed at Tristan, shaking his head.
You tool, what have you done this time?
I flew into the wall.
Tristan grumbled, blood beginning to patch on his brow. Kyan rolled his eyes.
Go, I'll deal with this.
Kyan waved off Arthur and Peter. Arthur and Peter bolted, Maria following after them with a slight hesitation. They dodged and weaved through the crowd of citizens, running through the main street past wagons and carriages full of hay. Kyan sighed and grabbed Tristan's arm.
Come on, we've got to catch up.
Tristan shook his head.
I'll find my own way out, trust me.
Don't be a tool. Get moving, now.
Barons exploded around the corner, Galahad and Marlon running straight for the pair.
The hell are you two doing? Run!
Marlon commanded, turning around to scatter a row of boxes stacked against the wall across the alleyway. Tristan shoved Kyan off his arm.
Go already. I'll just drag you guys down.
If you end up dead, Arthur will kill me.
Kyan growled and ran off after the rest of them. Marlon and Gawain ran behind him, Marlon looking back at Tristan with a scowl.
Garrison!
Tristan blinked his eyes hard and turned down the other alley, waving towards the barons.
Hey you big robed bastards. Come and get me if you know what's good for you.
The barons turned to him and immediately ran after him, Tristan's eyes widening as he staggered down the alleyway, cursing to himself.
Stop!
You stop!
Tristan found himself in a crowded marketway, wagons and carriages riding past him down the alleyway. He grinned mischievously and ran down the alleyway, dodging around the carriages with a stumble. His shoulder clipped one as it passed, making him groan in pain and clutch his arm. The barons made their way out of the alleyway, scouring over the market area. Tristan looked behind him in alarm and quickly ducked around a cart, sliding in underneath it and balancing himself on the axles.
Search the area!
The baron commanded, people scattering from their presence. Tristan watched them walk past the cart he hid beneath with a sigh, resting his head on the wooden bar beneath him. The cart suddenly jolted and began moving, Tristan gasping and holding on tightly with his legs.
Uh-oh.
Where did he go?
The baron called, looking around behind the dormant carts and behind crates. The barons around the marketway peered through the windows of the shops, sprouting along the walls, people moving out of their way in fright. Suddenly, the tailgate of the cart that passed them fell open, apples spilling over the heads of the barons. The black cloaks shouted in surprise and pain, the commotion turning the heads of the other barons down the way. 4 men stood on the back of the cart, feigning looks of surprise. All were dressed in farmers' clothes, their skin covered in dust and specks of charcoal.
Oh, sorry there, boys.
One of the men said, leaning off the side of the cart.
They're a bit heavy, you see.
His grin shone against his deep brown skin. His black hair scrambled above his grey-brown eyes, gleaming with mischief. One of the men on the cart chucked the crate onto the nearest baron, the assassin exclaiming in protest as he fell to the ground onto the apples. He laughed at the 2 barons jumping onto the carriage, their weapons at the ready. He offered his arms up towards them, his skin light in the sun beneath the dirt coating him. His moustache crinkled with a grin, his brown hair smoothed back by the wind hovering over blue eyes set in a strong face.
If you need more apples, give us a yell,
he said to them, and kicked more crates at them powerfully. One of the barons shot off the cart as the crate barreled into his chest, landing on the ground with a grunt. The man on the side pulled back onto the small platform at the front of the cart and slapped the horse's rear, saluting the fallen barons as the cart rocketed through the alleyway. Citizens and barons scrambled out of the way of the wild cart, the man grabbing the reins and steering it down a clear alley, seating himself on the front bench and bracing his legs on the pole with a laugh. The baron remaining on the cart stumbled at the sudden shift of gravity, falling to his rear end into the boxes bouncing against the barriers. 3 of the men picked the baron up by the limbs roughly and swung him overboard, the black cloak rolling down the alleyway uncontrollably. The moustached man laughed hysterically, holding the side of the cart and raising his hand up in the air as they left the barons in their dust. A faint knocking noise sounded from underfoot, getting faster the rockier the road became. The man looked down in confusion.
Stop the carriage,
he called to the front. The driver pulled the carriage into a secluded alleyway, their carriage hidden from view behind another cart holding barrels of wine. The man jumped onto the ground off the edge of the carriage, kneeling down to examine the underside. A wide-eyed Tristan clung to the axles for dear life, shaking in his boots and staring at the man.
Where in the ether is this carriage going in such a hurry?
Looks like we got a stowaway.
The man huffed in amusement. Adrenaline rushed through Arthur as he led the group down the streets, looking back at his group and counting heads, seeing Marlon and Galahad catching up to them.
Gods, they're fast.
They were almost at the southern gates now. It wasn't too far. Maria ran beside him, her breath rushed.
Where's Tristan and Kyan?
They're back there somewhere. Maybe they took another route.
From your left!
Peter shouted, barreling towards Arthur. Arthur flicked his eyes over to his left, his eyes widening. An apple cart came speeding towards him from the intersection, the horse running rampant.
Shit!
Arthur yelled, trying to slow down. Maria gasped and slowed back, grabbing for a gutter pipe and pulling back behind the wall.
Jump now!
Galahad yelled from behind Peter. Arthur's breath rushed from him as Peter jump-tackled him across the alley, the cart speeding past Arthur with a hand's breadth to spare, his heart skipping a beat at the closeness. He and Peter rolled across the cobblestones, the small rocks on the path scratching Arthur's arm as he rolled. They both looked up to watch the cart speed past, getting back on their feet quickly. Marlon panted as he watched the cart go by, looking at Galahad.
Typical apple carriage.
And guess who's on it?
Galahad said with a smirk. Marlon rolled his eyes and turned to Arthur.
That's our ticket out of here, so start running after those apples.
The apple cart?
Arthur exclaimed, looking back at him with widened eyes.
It nearly killed us, and that's our escape route.
Oliver never was a subtle planner.
I am too.
The man on the carriage yelled at him, grinning widely.
Well, he's not stopping anytime soon.
Peter observed, unsure whether to run.
We're busting through the southern gates. Make sure you lot are behind us.
Come on,
Arthur said. The group ran after the carriage quickly, dodging the debris flying out from behind the carriage. Behind them, an entire array of barons followed, a few of them wielding bows. A handful of barons stopped in place, loading their bows with 3 arrows each. Maria looked back behind them, exclaiming in alarm. The barons fired their arrows straight at them, all grabbing another 3 arrows from their quivers. The arrows flew past Arthur, zooming over his head and embedding into the wood of the carriage crates. A few arrows speared into one of the men on the carriage, his cry of pain echoing the thud of his body, landing on the deck of the cart.
Get down!
Oliver yelled at the others on the carriage. Peter yelled in pain, and Arthur looked over to him. An arrow shot through his arm, the head sticking out through his bicep. Maria slowed back slightly, her eyes tilted up to the sky. The archers lined up their shots, aiming the second round of arrows straight towards them. Maria snapped her attention around to them, her eyes glaring as they changed colour to a rustic gold that enveloped her whole eye. Barking echoed from around the barons, packs of wild stray dogs leaping onto them with snarls, ripping at their limbs. Their bows scattered across the alleyway as they yelled and fought the dogs, whines of pain filling the air. Arthur paused and ran back to her, grabbing her arm and spotting her eyes.
And you talk to dogs too?
She turned to him impassively, her gaze unseeing with the dog-like eyes pinned on him.
I can summon any animal, Arthur.
Talk sounds better.
Shadows clouded over the top of them from the roofs, barons darting across the shingles. Oliver looked up at the sudden shadows casting over him, his eyes widening.
Look out from above!
Marlon looked up at the rooftops and darted towards the walls.
Stay under the gutters.
The group shifted under the overhanging gutters, out of view from the rooftops, dodging the shingles being thrown at them. Slate shattered on the ground in front of Arthur, shards flicking around them dangerously. The cart barreled down a new alleyway, slowing back as it crawled underneath a small footbridge.
Quickly!
Oliver waved, opening the tailgate of the carriage.
Jump in!
Arthur boosted Maria up first into the back, her eyes blinking clear as she took Oliver's hand. Arthur looked back at Peter, the trainee's face scrunched in pain as his hand pressed against the arrow wound.
This is going to hurt like a bitch.
Peter growled and gripped the side of the carriage with both hands, pulling himself up with a painful roar. A few of the rebels inside helped him up, holding their hand out for the others. Arthur looked back at Galahad and Marlon, the two men catching up and pulling themselves onto the carriage expertly. A familiar figure darted from around a corner, Kian's chest heaving heavily as he sprinted towards the cart, Barons trailing behind him closely.
Kyan, where's Tristan? Don't tell me he's left him.
Kyan ran to the base of the cart, holding his hand up to one of the men to pull him up, collapsing to the wood breathlessly. Sweat coated his clothes and face as he panted, looking at Arthur.
Where is he?
Kyan shook his head, lifting his hands to gesture back where he ran. Arthur scowled at Kyan, gripping the rail on the side of the cart and putting his feet up on a small platform to the side of the wheel.
Unbelievable. I left this tool to defend Tristan, and he ended up saving himself.
Hatred blossomed in Arthur's chest. Oliver pulled the tailgate shut, sliding the bolt into the lock and finding a seat. Galahad looked around the carriage, his brow crinkled.
Where's Arthur?
Marlon reached down to grip Arthur's arm, heaving him on board the carriage like a rag doll.
Right here.
Arthur immediately moved over to Kyan and landed a punch to his jaw.
You left Tristan.
Kyan's eyes widened in alarm, and he raised his arms up in defense.
He said he'd catch up.
I told you to help him, no matter what he said.
Arthur, stop.
Maria said, trying to grab his arm.
You never leave your men behind, you coward.
Leave who behind?
A voice said from behind a barrel. Arthur looked over to the voice, panting heavily in anger. Wide eyes peered over the barrel, as familiar as breathing air to him.
What are you doing on the apple cart?
Tristan asked, a half-bitten apple in hand. Arthur scowled over at Kyan.
You're lucky.
Kyan spat blood at Arthur's feet.
Royal prick. I ought to kick your ass.
He snorted, turning away from him and moving over to Peter.
How did you get on this cart, Tristan?
Well, the Barons were chasing me down the market alley that was packed full of people buying...
The short version, please, Tristan.
Oh, you guys never let me explain a full story. I hid under the cart from the black cloaks and ended up finding Sir Geraint by accident.
I'm sorry, who?
Sir Oliver Geraint. At your service, my liege.
Oliver smiled, bowing at Arthur. Peter's eyes widened, amazement on his face.
What is the meaning of all this? The old Roundtable was thought dead, and now 3 of them are before me.
Well, we're not dead. Not yet, at least.
Though for a good while I thought he was dead, with all this fake name business.
Fake name? Don't you take pride in your name, Jonathan?
Marlon sat against the side of the carriage, scowling at them. Kyan looked at him, his eyes suspicious.
So it is true.
Your name truly isn't Marlon.
Marlon looked at them flatly, taking in their curious eyes and bated breath.
No.
So what is it then?
This old bag is Sir Jonathan Gawain,
Galahad nodded to him.
the good old Red Knight of the Round Table, King Benjamin's Legion.
Second in command of the Round Table and a close friend to all of us, who he loves very much.
Geraint said, smirking at Gawain, who snorted at him.
Where are the rest of you? Where have you been hiding all this time?
Maria asked, her face curious. Geraint looked at Maria, smiling at her faintly.
That will be explained shortly, my darling. Firstly, we've got to get out of Londinium.
A crash sounded from outside, the cart jutting sharply upwards. Arthur's hand gripped the side of the cart tightly, keeping him in place as the others shifted about, the crates knocking against each other. Maria cried out in shock as she was flung back, landing onto Arthur's lap as Tristan flew over the barrels,
look out!
yelping as he landed on his back on top of Kyan. Kyan growled at him, shoving him off, Peter cursing as his arm bumped the wall.
Gods, that hurt.
Well, we're out of Londinium.
Gawain murmured. Arthur's eyes widened, looking at Maria, her arms pushing awfully close to parts he valued.
Comfortable?
She looked up at him, her flushed face making her green eyes stand out.
Apologies, Arthur,
She said faintly, peeling herself off of him.
Where are you taking us?
Arthur asked, looking at Geraint.
To a safe haven of sorts.
The cart stopped after a while, a few voices sounding around them, horses' hooves trotting around them. Arthur's eyes flashed in alarm, getting to his feet. More barons? The tailgate flung open, people dressed in tunics, not black cloaks, thank the gods, ushering them off of the cart. Peter held his arm, blood staining the sleeve of his grey shirt as he moved towards the edge, jumping down to the ground. The others followed suit, Tristan almost tripping over the lip, but thankfully catching himself. Arthur exited the cart, looking around the area. They were at the edge of the forest, quite a bit away from Camelot on a small crest to the right of the river. The castle sat to his left, the sun glancing off the windows of the facade glaring at him, as if accusingly. Arthur stared at the castle while walking down the small hill, sighing deeply to himself.
Things will never be the same now.
But wasn't that what he wished for? Change was all he wanted for himself. But this was a whole other level he wasn't expecting. Maria looked over at him, her face softening as she followed his gaze.
It feels huge, right? To be outside of Camelot.
This isn't what I was expecting. Being a wanted man in my own home and having to flee the kingdom wasn't on my card of things I predicted.
It could be worse.
How?
You could be alone.
It's just lucky that I'm not.
He wouldn't know what in the ether he'd do if the others weren't here. He probably wouldn't have even made it out of Londinium without them. Her lips spread in a bright smile, her eyes glittering in the sun. Something about them made Arthur feel safe, something stirring in him he couldn't quite name. He pushed it to the side, thinking it was irrelevant.
I probably could do without Kyan, if I'm honest.
I think everyone can do without Kyan. He doesn't know when to use his head right.
Arthur chuckled, walking up to the group on top of the hill.
And probably never will.
He can't use it for attracting women despite his beliefs.
The two walked up to the others, a rebel assessing Peter's wound with a grim look, while the others recovered from the chase, spread out amongst the piles of hay and parked carriages. Galahad walked up to one of the rebels, panting faintly.
Connor?
The rebel turned to look at Galahad, sharp features lifting chestnut brows at him.
Jameson? It's been, 3 hours? That was a quick run.
Where's your leader?
I wouldn't know. You'll hear him before you see him, though.
Now there's a statement I can get behind.
A voice sounded from beside a carriage. Galahad turned to the carriage, raising his eyebrow at him.
Were you standing there the whole time?
You're awfully unobservant, Galahad,
he purred. A man with long black hair leaned against a cartwheel with his arms crossed, smirking at Galahad.
Hey, Gawain, I found your buddy.
Gawain looked over at Galahad, his eyebrows lowered as he walked over.
What makes you think anyone is my favorite knight here in particular?
The man's eyes lit in surprise, his smirk turning to a grin.
Jonathan Gawain, I thought you were...
Dead. So did I. He had a fake name.
Fake name? Who wouldn't recognise that mug? The man is a walking legend.
1, I'm not dead. 2, how did you think Camelot kept getting knights? Someone had to train them after Mordred retired. 3, you'd be surprised how gullible some of them are.
He growled, looking over at Tristan.
You've got a point.
Arthur walked over to them, spotting the man leaning against the carriage.
Who's he?
This tool is...
Sir Ryan Bedivere.
The man bowed dramatically, smirking at Arthur. His soil eyes seemed to be living with mischief. Arthur couldn't decide if the glint in his eyes was the sun or madness.
Now who are you?
Arthur Pendragon.
Bedivere frowned, his brows knitting together.
Who?
He turned to Galahad. Arthur blinked. He had to be the only person in Brainer that didn't know who he was.
Benjamin's son, you idiot.
Benjamin had a son? He sure doesn't look like him.
Arthur frowned, a huff of disbelief escaping his nose. He thought he looked at least a little like his father, from what he could remember. He wouldn't know what his mother looked like, so it was hard to judge.
Yes. Ergot has overruled Camelot and killed the Knights of the Round Table, and he's framed Arthur for their murder.
Bedivere snorted, laughter riddling across the camp.
He tried to frame the Crown Prince. What an absolute tool.
We barely escaped the Barons. They're Ergot's new protectors,
Arthur said, looking at Bedivere with narrowed eyes.
Well, at least you got out of that hellhole. The Black Cloaks are daft and difficult to deal with.
So what happens now?
Arthur asked, looking at the 4 men.
Well, the plan was to get you to the party on time, but I think we're past the deadline.
Bedivere mused, a sly look on his face.
Even Cinderella had better timing than you.
Galahad frowned at Bedivere, looking back at Arthur.
We need to get you somewhere safe.
Tristan walked over to the group, holding a wrap in his hand, a mouthful already bitten off.
Where are we going? What party?
Geraint looked at Gawain.
Where to?
Is that my rap?
Connor frowned, his brown eyes squinting at him in suspicion. Tristan looked at him with wide eyes.
We go to the hideout. It's the only place we can go.
Well?
Geraint said, mounting the horse beside him.
What are we waiting for?
Peter to get the arrow from his arm,
Gawain said, looking down the camp.
The arrow isn't out?
A pained yell echoed from one of the carriages, a stream of curse words following it.
It is now.
Bedivere laughed.
How long will the trip take?
A few hours. It's only just south of here.
Galahad shrugged and moved towards the carriage.
It's a wonder nobody's found you tools yet. You make yourselves present everywhere else.
You say that like it's a problem, Gawain.
It's a problem if we get caught.
Don't be so glum, old boy.
Galahad grinned, stepping up into the carriage.
We've been hidden for this long. We can hide for another 2 or so decades.
If anyone can get us caught, it's that one.
Geraint pointed to Bedivere. Bedivere lifted his arms up in protest.
Since when do I bring any attention to myself?
Remember the trip to Sarum?
Galahad lifted a brow.
Where you stole multiple pairs of socks to keep your hands warm.
Bedivere shrugged nonchalantly.
It was cold and I didn't want your germy foot mittens.
Arthur climbed inside of the carriage.
You lot are an interesting bunch.
Welcome to the life of a bunch of old knights, sire.
Geraint grinned, turning his horse around. The group gathered themselves and jumped on board the carriages as the rebels began to depart from the hill, heading into the forest in front of them on carriages and horseback. Arthur settled himself beside the door, waiting for the others to join him.
Gods help me.